My sister Delilah burst into hysterical laughter when she saw me pull up to our family reunion in what she called my pathetic little Honda. What she didn't know was that the quiet man in the navy suit standing behind me wasn't my husband. He was my billionaire husband's personal driver, and the real shock was about to change everything she thought she knew about my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of August 15th started like any other Saturday in my cozy apartment in Millbrook Heights. I was preparing for the annual Carmichael family reunion, an event I'd been dreading for weeks. My phone buzzed with yet another text from my older sister Delilah. "Can't wait to see what disaster of an outfit you're wearing this year. Mom says you're still driving that ancient Honda? Embarrassing!" I stared at the message, feeling the familiar knot form in my stomach. Delilah had always been the successful one in our family, the real estate mogul with her luxury condo in downtown Silverton, her designer wardrobe, and her constant need to remind everyone of her achievements. Meanwhile, I was Natasha, the quiet elementary school teacher who lived modestly and apparently drove a car that offended my sister's sensibilities. What Delilah didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that my life was far more complicated than it appeared on the surface. I walked to my closet and selected a simple floral sundress, nothing too fancy. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention or create more ammunition for Delilah's cutting remarks. As I slipped on my modest pearl earrings, a gift from my late grandmother, I caught my reflection in the mirror. At 28, I still looked young, maybe even naive, exactly what my family expected from little Natasha, who chose teaching over more practical careers. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth," came the familiar, respectful voice of Jonathan, my husband's personal assistant. "Mr. Ashworth wanted me to confirm that everything is arranged for this afternoon. Thomas will be ready to drive you to the reunion at exactly 11:30 as requested." "Thank you, Jonathan," I replied, glancing at the clock. "And please remind Thomas about what we discussed, the navy suit, not the uniform. It's important that he blends in." "Of course, ma'am, he understands completely. Will there be anything else you need?" I hesitated for a moment, thinking about the conversation I'd had with my husband Alexander the night before. "Actually, yes. Please make sure Thomas has his identification ready. I have a feeling it might be needed today." After ending the call, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the simple wedding band that most people assumed came from a modest jewelry store. In reality, it was a vintage Cartier piece that Alexander had chosen specifically because it was understated, like everything else about our carefully constructed public life. Alexander Ashworth. Even thinking his name still gave me butterflies after 2 years of marriage. To the world, he was the reclusive tech billionaire who'd revolutionized cloud computing before the age of 35. To me, he was the man who brought me coffee in bed every morning when he was in town, who listened to my stories about my third-grade students with genuine interest, and who understood why I needed to keep my real life separate from my family's expectations and judgments. We'd made the decision early in our relationship to keep our marriage private. Alexander valued his privacy intensely, having grown up in the spotlight as the heir to the Ashworth technology empire. And I'd seen what happened when people discovered someone had more than they expected. The way friendships changed, how every gesture became suspect, how genuine relationships became impossible to distinguish from opportunistic ones. My family believed I'd married a nice, quiet man named Alex who worked in tech support. They'd met him exactly once at a carefully orchestrated coffee shop encounter where Alexander had played the role perfectly, humble, soft-spoken, clearly devoted to me, but not particularly impressive by Delilah's standards. She'd barely given him a second glance, dismissing him as, quote, "but definitely not going anywhere fast." If only she knew that the man she'd written off so casually had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine just 6 months earlier, or that the tech support company he supposedly worked for was actually his own multi-billion-dollar corporation. At 11:20, I gathered my purse and the homemade strawberry pie I'd baked for the reunion, another detail that would reinforce my family's perception of me as the simple, domestic one who couldn't afford store-bought desserts. I walked downstairs to the building's entrance, where Thomas was waiting beside the modest Honda Civic that had become an essential part of our carefully maintained facade. Thomas Whitfield had been with the Ashworth family for over 15 years, starting as Alexander's bodyguard, before transitioning to the role of personal driver and trusted confidant. He was a former military man in his early 50s, with the kind of quiet competence that made him nearly invisible in most social situations, exactly the quality we needed for days like today. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth," he said with a slight nod, opening the passenger door for me. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed navy suit that made him look like any middle-aged professional, nothing that would suggest his actual role in our lives. "Morning, Thomas. Are you ready for this performance?" I asked, settling into the car. He chuckled as he started the engine. "I've been briefed thoroughly, ma'am." "Today I'm Tom, your husband's colleague who offered to drive you since Alex is out of town on business. I work in IT, I have 2 kids in college, and I drive this car because it's reliable and good on gas." "Perfect," I said, feeling a mixture of amusement and anxiety about what the day would bring. "And remember, no matter what my sister says or does, I remain in character," Thomas finished. "Don't worry, Mrs. Ashworth. I've handled much more complicated situations than a family reunion." As we drove through the winding roads toward Grandview Park, where the reunion was being held, I found myself rehearsing the conversations I knew were coming. Delilah would ask about my job, my finances, my husband's absence, my car, my clothes. Everything would be subject to her analysis and inevitable criticism. She'd compare her success to my apparent lack thereof, probably in front of our cousins and aunts, who still saw me as the little girl who used to hide behind my mother's skirt at these gatherings. "Mrs. Ashworth," Thomas said gently, glancing at me in the rearview mirror, "if I may say so, you seem more nervous than usual about today." I sighed, appreciating his concern. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if we're making this more complicated than it needs to be. All this pretending, all these careful performances. Maybe it would be easier to just tell them the truth." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "In my experience, ma'am, the truth has a way of coming out when it's meant to. And when it does, you'll know whether the people who matter can handle it with grace." His words proved to be more prophetic than either of us realized. As we turned into the park's entrance, I could already see the familiar chaos of the Carmichael family reunion spread across the pavilion area. Folding tables loaded with food, children running between the trees, and adults clustered in their usual social groups. And there, standing near the parking area like a sentinel surveying her domain, was Delilah. She was everything I wasn't: tall, confident, impeccably dressed in what I recognized as a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her auburn hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless, her posture radiating the kind of success that demanded attention and respect. As Thomas pulled the Honda into a parking space near the pavilion, I saw Delilah's eyes widen with what could only be described as gleeful anticipation. She immediately started walking toward us, her phone already in her hand, no doubt preparing to document what she clearly saw as another opportunity to highlight the gap between our lifestyles. "Showtime," I murmured to Thomas. "Indeed," he replied, stepping out of the car with the measured movements of someone completely comfortable in his assumed role. "Let's give them a performance they'll remember." Neither of us had any idea just how memorable this performance was about to become. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The moment I stepped out of the Honda, Delilah's laughter echoed across the parking area like a bell announcing my arrival to the entire family reunion. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at my car as she called out loud enough for everyone within 50 feet to hear. "Oh my God, Natasha, you're still driving that piece of junk?" Delilah's voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, equal parts amusement and pity, wrapped in a thin veneer of sisterly concern. "Seriously, that car is older than some of our cousins' kids." I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks as heads turned in our direction. Aunt Priscilla paused mid-conversation with Uncle Raymond to stare. Cousin Bradley, who was setting up the volleyball net, actually stopped what he was doing to look. Even the children seemed to sense the sudden shift in adult attention. Thomas smoothly exited the driver's side, his movements calm and professional despite the growing audience. I watched several family members' eyes track to him with curiosity. A stranger at our traditionally family-only gathering always drew attention. "And who's this?" Delilah asked, her tone shifting slightly as she took in Thomas's well-dressed appearance. Her real estate agent instincts were clearly activated. She could spot quality clothing and grooming from across a parking lot. "This is Tom," I said, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. "He works with Alex and offered to drive me since Alex is out of town on business." Thomas stepped forward with a polite smile, extending his hand to Delilah. "Tom Whitfield, pleasure to meet you. Natasha's told me so much about her family." Delilah's handshake lingered just a beat too long as she assessed him. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Expensive suit, confident bearing, older and distinguished. This didn't fit her narrative about my modest lifestyle and my supposedly unremarkable husband. "How thoughtful of you to drive her," Delilah said, her voice taking on the honeyed tone she used when she was fishing for information. "That's quite a long way from downtown Silverton, isn't it? Where did you say you work?" "Meridian Tech Solutions," Thomas replied smoothly, using the cover story we'd prepared. "We're a small but growing company. Alex and I have worked together for several years now." My mother, Patricia, approached our little group with the cautious smile she wore whenever she sensed potential family drama brewing. At 62, she developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when her daughters were about to create a scene. "Natasha, sweetheart," Mom said, pulling me into a warm hug that smelled like her signature lavender perfume. "I'm so glad you made it. And this must be Tom, Alex's colleague?" "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied with exactly the right amount of deference. "Thank you for allowing me to join your family gathering. Natasha mentioned you make the best potato salad in 3 counties. Mom's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Oh, you flatterer, I hope you brought your appetite." But Delilah wasn't about to let the conversation drift toward pleasantries. She positioned herself directly in front of me, arms crossed, wearing the expression I remembered from childhood, the one that said she was about to prove a point that would undoubtedly embarrass me. "Natasha, we need to talk about this car situation," she announced, her voice carrying across the pavilion area. "It's honestly embarrassing. What if it breaks down? What if you get stranded somewhere, and the image it projects?" "Delilah," I said quietly, "it's just a car. It gets me where I need to go." "Just a car?" She gestured dramatically toward the Honda. "Honey, I spend more on my monthly car payment than that thing is worth. And don't even get me started on the safety concerns. Those older models don't have the modern safety features." "Actually," Thomas interjected politely, "that's a 2018 model. Honda makes excellent vehicles. Very reliable, great safety ratings." Delilah's eyes snapped to him, clearly annoyed that her performance was being interrupted by facts. "Well, yes, I'm sure it's adequate. But surely someone in tech could afford something more substantial?" The way she said tech made it sound like a hobby rather than a profession. I saw Thomas's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Delilah's condescending tone was affecting him. We believe in living within our means, Thomas replied evenly. Financial responsibility is important to us. Financial responsibility, Delilah repeated, her laugh sharp and brittle. That's certainly one way to put it. Cousin Bradley had drifted closer during this exchange, drawn by the obvious tension. At 35, he was the family's self-appointed mediator, always trying to smooth over conflicts before they escalated into full family feuds. "Hey, Tasha," Bradley said with forced cheerfulness, using my childhood nickname. "Great to see you. And Tom, right? Thanks for making sure our girl got here safely." "My pleasure," Thomas said, and I could tell he genuinely meant it. Beautiful park for a family gathering. "Oh, it's perfect," Bradley agreed, then made the mistake of trying to redirect the conversation. "Delilah was just telling us about her new listing, a $5 million estate in Pinehurst Gardens. Apparently, the previous owner was some tech entrepreneur who made it big." The irony of Bradley's comment wasn't lost on me. If only he knew that the tech entrepreneur in question was probably someone Alexander had either mentored, funded, or competed with. The tech world in our region was smaller than most people realized, especially at the highest levels. Delilah's eyes lit up at the opportunity to showcase her success. "Actually, it's $5.2 million, and yes, apparently the owner sold his company to some larger corporation for an absolutely obscene amount of money. Can you imagine? Just for creating some software that most people can't even pronounce." Thomas and I exchanged the briefest of glances. Alexander's company had been particularly active in acquisitions lately, and the description sounded suspiciously familiar. "The tech industry can be quite lucrative," Thomas observed mildly. "For some people," Delilah said pointedly, her gaze sliding back to me. "Of course, you have to actually be successful in it. Not everyone who works in tech is making millions, obviously." The implication was clear. Whatever Alex did in tech support, it certainly wasn't making us wealthy. The evidence was right there in my modest appearance, my old car, my simple lifestyle. "Delilah," Mom said with a warning tone that we all recognized from childhood. But Delilah was on a roll now, energized by the audience and the opportunity to demonstrate her superior status. "I'm just saying, Natasha, you're still young. You don't have to settle for mediocrity. Look at what you could have if you were just a little more ambitious." "I'm perfectly happy with my life," I said, my voice carrying more edge than I intended. "Are you, though?" Delilah pressed. "Teaching elementary school, driving that car, living in that tiny apartment. When was the last time you traveled somewhere exotic? When did you last buy something really nice for yourself? When did you last feel accomplished?" The questions hit like physical blows, each one designed to highlight what Delilah perceived as my failures and limitations. Around us, family members were pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word. Thomas stepped slightly closer to me, a subtle gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. "Natasha speaks very highly of her students," he said firmly. "Education is one of the most important professions in our society." "Oh, absolutely," Delilah said with mock sincerity. "Teaching is very noble. It's just not very practical, is it? I mean, the pay scale alone." "Delilah, that's enough." The voice belonged to our father, Douglas, who had approached the group with the measured steps of a man preparing to intervene in a situation that was spiraling out of control. At 65, Dad still carried himself with the authority of his 30-year career as a high school principal. He'd seen enough family dynamics play out over the years to recognize when one of his daughters was crossing lines. "Hi, Daddy," I said, grateful for his arrival. He kissed my cheek before turning to Thomas with the polite but assessing gaze he'd perfected from meeting the various boyfriends and partners his daughters had brought home over the years. "You must be Tom," Dad said, extending his hand. "Douglas Carmichael, thank you for driving Natasha today." "Tom Whitfield, sir, it's an honor to meet you." Dad's handshake lasted just long enough to take Thomas's measure, something he'd done with every man who'd entered his daughter's lives since we'd started dating. I could see him noting the quality of Thomas's suit, his confident posture, his respectful but not deferential manner. "Tom works with Alex," I explained. "Ah, the mysterious husband," Dad said with a slight smile. "Still traveling for business, I assume?" "Yes, sir. Alex sends his regrets. He wanted very much to be here." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "And what exactly do you and Alex do at, what was it, Meridian Tech?" Thomas didn't miss a beat. "We specialize in cloud computing solutions for enterprise clients. It's complex work, but very rewarding." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the pavilion. My 8-year-old cousin Lily came running toward us, her face flushed with excitement. "Aunt Delilah! Aunt Delilah!" she called out. "There's a really cool car in the parking lot. It's black and shiny, and it looks like something a movie star would drive." Delilah's attention immediately shifted, her real estate agent's curiosity piqued. "Where, honey?" "Over there." Lily pointed toward the far end of the parking area. "Some man in a suit got out of it, and he's walking this way." I felt my blood turn to ice. Thomas and I exchanged alarmed glances. There was only one reason someone would be arriving at the family reunion in what sounded like an expensive luxury vehicle. Alexander. My billionaire husband, who was supposed to be out of town on business, was walking directly toward our carefully orchestrated performance. And from the expression on Thomas's face, this was not part of any plan we discussed. The secret I'd spent 2 years protecting was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible, in front of my entire family, with Delilah as the primary witness to my life's complete transformation. "Excuse me," I whispered to Thomas, my voice barely audible. "I think we have a problem." The man approaching us across the park's manicured lawn was unmistakably Alexander, even at a distance. I'd recognize that confident stride anywhere, the way he moved with purpose but without hurry, commanding attention without demanding it. He was dressed in what I knew was a $3,000 tailored charcoal suit, though to most observers it would simply look like very good taste. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched my carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Thomas stepped closer to me, his expression professionally calm despite what I knew must be his own internal alarm bells. "Mrs. Ashworth," he murmured under his breath, "I wasn't informed of any changes to Mr. Ashworth's travel schedule." "Neither was I," I whispered back, my mouth suddenly dry as cotton. Delilah, meanwhile, had perked up like a bloodhound catching a scent. Her real estate agent instincts were in full overdrive as she tracked Alexander's approach, clearly noting every detail of his appearance and demeanor. "Now that," she said to no one in particular, "is what success looks like." Little Lily bounced excitedly beside her aunt. "He looks like a prince. Or maybe a secret agent." "Hush, Lily," Delilah said absently, her attention completely focused on the approaching figure. "Natasha, do you know who that is? He seems to be walking directly toward us." I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. What could I possibly say? The truth was too enormous, too unbelievable. But lies were becoming impossible as Alexander drew closer. "Perhaps it's someone looking for directions," Thomas suggested smoothly, though I could hear the tension beneath his professional tone. Dad stepped slightly forward, his principal instincts activated by the arrival of an unknown person at what was clearly a private family gathering. "Can I help you?" he called out as Alexander came within speaking distance. Alexander's smile was warm and genuine as he approached our little group. "I'm looking for my wife," he said simply. The words hit the assembled family like a physical force. Mom's hand went to her throat in surprise. Bradley's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. Cousin Lily looked around in confusion, clearly trying to figure out which of the adult women this handsome stranger was married to. But it was Delilah's reaction that was most pronounced. Her face went through a rapid series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like fear as the implications began to settle in. "Your wife?" Dad repeated, his voice carefully neutral. Alexander's eyes found mine across the small crowd, and his expression softened with unmistakable affection. "Hello, darling. I finished my meetings early and thought I'd surprise you." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the gears turning in my family's minds as they tried to process this information. The modest elementary school teacher with the old Honda was married to this obviously wealthy, sophisticated man? "Alex?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Wait," Delilah said sharply, her voice cutting through the stunned quiet. "Wait just a minute. Alex? This is Alex." She looked back and forth between Alexander and me, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching panic. "This is your husband?" "The tech support guy." Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly at the description, but his smile remained steady. "Tech support is one way to describe what I do." Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mr. Ashworth, sir. Perhaps we should." "Mr. Ashworth?" Delilah interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "Did he just call you Mr. Ashworth?" The color was rapidly draining from her face as pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve began clicking into place. Her real estate agent's mind was working overtime, connecting dots that led to conclusions she clearly found terrifying. "Ashworth," she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. "Alexander Ashworth?" Alexander extended his hand to my father, ignoring Delilah's obvious distress. "Douglas, I presume? I'm Alexander Ashworth." "I apologize for missing so many family gatherings. Business travel keeps me away far too often." Dad shook his hand automatically, but his expression showed he was still processing the dramatic shift in circumstances. "Mr. Ashworth, this is unexpected." "Daddy," I said quietly, "I can explain." But Delilah was having what could only be described as a breakdown. "No," she said, backing away from the group as if Alexander were carrying a contagious disease. No, this can't be right." "Delilah," Mom said worriedly, "what's wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me?" Delilah's laugh was high and brittle. "Do you know who Alexander Ashworth is? Do any of you know who he is?" The family looked around at each other with blank expressions. To them, he was just a well-dressed man who claimed to be my husband. But Delilah's professional life in luxury real estate meant she moved in circles where certain names carried enormous weight. "He's only one of the richest men in the entire state," Delilah's voice was approaching hysteria. "Ashworth Technologies, the Forbes list. The tech billionaire who bought the Pemberton estate last year for $47 million. The silence that followed this revelation was different from before. This wasn't confused quiet. This was the stunned silence of people trying to recalibrate their entire understanding of reality. Bradley was the first to find his voice. "Billionaire?" he croaked. Alexander looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention, which only confirmed his identity to those who were still processing Delilah's claims. "I prefer to focus on the work we do rather than financial metrics," he said diplomatically. "Oh my God," Aunt Priscilla whispered from somewhere behind us. "Oh my God, it's true. I've seen him in the business section of the Silverton Tribune." Uncle Raymond pulled out his phone, clearly intending to verify this information immediately. Within seconds, his face confirmed what Delilah had announced. Alexander Ashworth, CEO and founder of Ashworth Technologies, net worth estimated at, Jesus Christ. "Language, Raymond," Mom said automatically, but her heart wasn't in the correction. She was staring at Alexander as if seeing him for the first time, which in many ways she was. "Natasha," Dad said slowly, his principal's voice taking on the tone he used when he was trying to understand a particularly complex situation. "You've been married to Alexander Ashworth for how long?" 2 years, I admitted quietly. 2 years, Delilah repeated, her voice hollow. 2 years, and you never said anything. You let us all think. You let me think. She trailed off, but I could see exactly what she was thinking. Every condescending comment about my lifestyle, every pitying look at my car, every suggestion that I was settling for mediocrity, all of it delivered to someone who was apparently married to one of the wealthiest men in the region. "You drove that Honda," she whispered, pointing at my car as if it were evidence of a crime. "You live in that tiny apartment. You shop at Target. You bring homemade pie to family gatherings instead of buying something from a proper bakery." "I like making pie," I said defensively, "and I like my apartment. It's close to my school." "Your school," Bradley repeated faintly. "You still teach elementary school, even though you're married to a billionaire." Alexander stepped closer to me, his hand finding mine in a gesture of support. "Natasha loves teaching. Her students adore her, and she's exceptional at what she does. Why would she give that up?" "Because she doesn't have to work," Delilah exploded. "She could do anything, go anywhere, buy anything. And instead she's teaching 8-year-olds their multiplication tables and driving a Honda Civic." The accusation in her voice made it clear that she viewed my choices as some kind of personal betrayal. In her world, wealth was meant to be displayed, success was meant to be flaunted, and opportunities were meant to be seized regardless of personal satisfaction. "Perhaps," Alexander said quietly, "that says more about what kind of person your sister is than what kind of person you think she should be." The gentle rebuke hit its mark. Delilah's face flushed red as she realized that her own values were being called into question by someone whose opinion actually carried weight in the circles she desperately wanted to impress. "I don't understand," Mom said, looking between Alexander and me with genuine confusion. "Why keep it secret? Why not tell us?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been dreading for 2 years. "Because of this," I said, gesturing to the chaos around us. "Because everything changes when people know. Relationships become about money instead of connection. Every conversation becomes about what you can afford rather than what you care about." "That's not true," Delilah protested weakly. "Isn't it?" I challenged. 5 minutes ago, you were lecturing me about my failures and limitations. Now you're angry that I didn't tell you I had money. Which person do you think is the real me? The one you've been dismissing for years, or the one you're looking at now?" Thomas stepped forward diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. You're beginning to attract attention from other park visitors." He was right. Our family drama was starting to draw curious looks from other families enjoying their Saturday afternoon at Grandview Park. Nothing drew attention quite like a group of adults having an intense discussion around someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. "Yes," Dad said firmly, his principal instincts taking charge. "Let's move this to the pavilion. And I think we all need to take a moment to process what we've learned before we say anything else we might regret." As the family began moving toward the pavilion area, Delilah lingered behind, staring at Alexander as if he might disappear if she looked away. "The Pemberton estate," she said quietly. "You really bought the Pemberton estate." Alexander nodded politely. "It's a beautiful property. Natasha fell in love with the gardens." "I've been trying to get a listing appointment there for 3 years, Delilah whispered. "The previous owners wouldn't even return my calls." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Delilah was beginning to understand that the life she thought she was living, successful, well-connected, at the top of her social and professional circles, was nothing compared to the reality my husband moved through every day. And for the first time since I'd known her, my sister looked genuinely, deeply humbled. As we settled around the large picnic table in the pavilion, the weight of what had just been revealed seemed to press down on everyone differently. Alexander sat beside me, his presence both comforting and somehow making everything feel more surreal. Thomas positioned himself strategically, where he could observe the family dynamics while maintaining his professional demeanor. But it was Delilah who commanded everyone's attention, even in her obvious distress. She sat across from us, her phone in her hands, scrolling through what I could only assume were search results about my husband. Every few seconds, her eyes would dart up to look at Alexander, then back to her screen, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the man sitting at our family picnic table with whatever she was reading. $47 million, she said suddenly, her voice hollow. You paid $47 million for a house, and I've been telling Natasha she needs to be more financially responsible. Mom reached across the table to touch Delilah's hand. Honey, maybe you should put the phone away for now. No, Delilah said, pulling her hand back. No, I need to understand this. I need to understand how completely I've been. How long has this been going on? What exactly do you mean? Alexander asked gently. Delilah's laugh was bitter. I mean the performance, the elaborate charade. How long have you two been making fools of us? We haven't been making fools of anyone, I said, feeling defensive. We just wanted privacy. Privacy? Delilah's voice rose again. You call letting me lecture you about your life choices privacy? Do you know what I said to Linda Pemberton at the country club last month? My stomach dropped. Linda Pemberton was the wife of the previous owner of the estate Alexander had purchased. More importantly, she was one of the most influential socialites in Silverton's upper circles. What did you say? Dad asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Delilah's face was crimson now. She mentioned something about the new owner of their estate, said he was married to a lovely young woman who was very down to earth. She asked if I knew anyone like that, since she'd heard the wife was local. Delilah paused, her breathing becoming shallow. I told her that the only person I could think of who fit that description was my sister. But that was impossible, because my sister was married to some tech support guy and could barely afford her rent. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Uncle Raymond and Aunt Priscilla exchanging glances, beginning to understand the broader implications of what had been happening. Oh, Delilah, Mom whispered. Linda Pemberton knows exactly who bought her house, Delilah continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. She was testing me. She was giving me a chance to talk about my sister's incredible marriage, and instead She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Alexander cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Pemberton is a gracious woman. I'm sure she didn't mean anything unkind by it. You don't understand, Delilah said, looking directly at him for the first time since sitting down. Linda Pemberton runs the Silverton Cultural Foundation. She's on the board of the Symphony Guild, the Art Museum, the Historical Society. When she asks about someone, it's because she's considering them for something important. Bradley leaned forward, beginning to grasp the situation. You mean she might have been thinking about including Natasha in some of those organizations? More than that, Delilah said miserably. The Pembertons have been the unofficial gatekeepers of Silverton society for 3 generations. If Linda was asking about Natasha, it means they'd already investigated and approved. It means they wanted to welcome her into their circle. Thomas and Alexander exchanged a look that suggested this wasn't entirely news to them. I had a sudden, sinking realization that there might be social implications to our marriage that I'd been blissfully unaware of. Alex, I said quietly, did you know about this? He reached for my hand. I knew that our marriage would eventually attract attention in certain circles. I'd hoped we could navigate that together when you were ready. But I turned it down for her, Delilah continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. When Linda asked if I knew anyone who might be interested in joining the foundation's junior board, I actually said that my sister wouldn't have time for that kind of thing because she was too busy with her real job. Aunt Priscilla gasped audibly. Delilah, you didn't. I did. I told Linda Pemberton that my sister was too practical for society functions. that she wasn't the type to get involved in charity galas and fundraising events. Delilah's hands were shaking now. I basically told one of the most powerful women in the city that Natasha wasn't worth her time. The full scope of what had happened was beginning to sink in for everyone at the table. This wasn't just about family dynamics or hurt feelings anymore. Delilah had unknowingly sabotaged opportunities that most people in Silverton would consider life-changing. "There's more," Delilah said, her voice getting even smaller. "The Hartwell Foundation fundraiser last spring. Remember, Natasha? I told you it would be a waste of time to volunteer because you wouldn't fit in with that crowd." I remembered. Delilah had been particularly cutting about it, suggesting that I'd be out of place among serious philanthropists and should stick to volunteering at the local elementary school fundraisers. "The Hartwell Foundation," Alexander said slowly, "provides educational grants to underprivileged schools throughout the region." "Oh, God," I breathed, understanding immediately. The foundation's work was exactly the kind of cause I would have been passionate about. If I'd volunteered, I might have made connections that could have benefited my students and my school. "And the Museum Guild's new member orientation," Delilah continued, her confession pouring out like water through a broken dam. "They sent you a personal invitation, remember? I told you it was probably a mistake, that they must have gotten your name from some random mailing list." Dad was staring at Delilah with an expression I'd never seen before, disappointment mixed with genuine shock. "Delilah, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking I was protecting her," Delilah burst out, tears finally starting to flow. "I thought she was naive, that she'd get involved with these organizations and end up feeling out of place or embarrassed. I thought I was saving her from situations where she'd be uncomfortable. Or," Bradley said quietly, "you thought she'd embarrass you." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Delilah's face crumpled as she realized that her brother had identified the truth she hadn't been willing to admit to herself. "I didn't want her to get hurt," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining gentle despite the gravity of what was being discussed. "Delilah, I need you to understand something. The invitations Natasha received weren't mistakes or random mailings. In circles like the ones you're describing, membership is by careful selection. Someone, likely multiple someones, specifically recommended her." "But how?" Delilah asked desperately. "How would they even know about her?" "Because," Thomas said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down, "people in those circles pay attention to things like community involvement, educational background, and character references. Mrs. Ashworth has been teaching at Maplewood Elementary for 6 years. She's known for her innovative teaching methods and her dedication to her students. She has a master's degree in education from Thornfield University, and she's been recommended by several prominent families whose children have been in her classes." The detailed knowledge in Thomas's response made it clear that this wasn't speculation. Someone, probably multiple someones, had been quietly investigating my background and finding me worthy of inclusion in Silverton's philanthropic community. "The Whitmore twins," I said suddenly, remembering. "Jessica and Jennifer Whitmore were in my class 3 years ago." Alexander nodded. "Their mother, Rebecca Whitmore, sits on the boards of both the Museum Guild and the Hartwell Foundation." Delilah's phone slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the picnic table. "Rebecca Whitmore recommended you." Rebecca Whitmore, whose husband owns half the commercial real estate in downtown Silverton, personally recommended my sister for these organizations, and I told them she wasn't interested. "It's worse than that," I said, the full picture finally becoming clear to me. "You didn't just decline on my behalf. You actively discouraged them from pursuing me as a candidate." The realization seemed to hit everyone at the table simultaneously. This wasn't just about missed opportunities or hurt feelings. Delilah had potentially damaged relationships and reputations, both mine and her own, through her systematic dismissal of what she'd perceived as charity toward her inadequate sister. "How many times," Dad asked quietly, "how many opportunities did you intercept?" Delilah was crying openly now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. I don't know. I thought I was helping. Every time someone mentioned Natasha in connection with these organizations, I just assumed they were being polite, or that they'd made some kind of mistake. Because in your mind, Mom said with dawning understanding, Natasha couldn't possibly be worthy of that kind of attention on her own merits. The truth of it settled over the table like a weight. For years, Delilah had been actively sabotaging my opportunities for social and professional advancement, convinced that she was protecting me from situations where I'd be revealed as inadequate. But in reality, she'd been protecting herself from having to acknowledge that her supposedly unsuccessful sister might actually be more accomplished and more valued than she'd ever imagined. And now, sitting across from the man who was not only my husband but one of the most influential people in the region, Delilah was being forced to confront the possibility that her entire understanding of success, worth, and social standing had been catastrophically wrong. I stared at my sister across the picnic table, watching her shoulders shake with sobs, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. For years, I had accepted Delilah's version of reality, that I was the naive little sister who needed protection from my own poor judgment. I had internalized her criticisms, questioned my own instincts, and allowed her to speak for me in situations where I should have spoken for myself. But sitting here now, with the full scope of her sabotage laid bare, I realized that my silence had been complicity. Every time I had deferred to her superior knowledge of the social world, every time I had accepted her dismissal of opportunities as being for my own good, I had enabled her to diminish not just my prospects but my sense of my own worth. "Stop crying," I said quietly. Delilah looked up, tears still streaming down her face, clearly expecting comfort or forgiveness. The rest of the family watched nervously, probably anticipating that I would do what I had always done: minimize the conflict, make excuses for her behavior, and try to smooth things over for everyone's sake. Instead, I stood up from the picnic table. "Stop crying," I repeated, my voice stronger now. "You don't get to be the victim here." "Natasha," Mom said cautiously, "maybe we should all take a moment." "No," I said firmly, cutting her off. "I've taken enough moments. I've spent years taking moments while Delilah made decisions about my life behind my back." Alexander reached for my hand, but I gently pulled away. This was something I needed to do on my own, something that was long overdue. "You want to know why I kept my marriage secret?" I asked, looking directly at Delilah. "It wasn't because I was ashamed of Alex or because I wanted to deceive anyone. It was because I knew that the moment you found out, everything would change. And not in a good way." "That's not fair," Delilah protested weakly. "Isn't it?" I challenged. "Look at what you're doing right now. 5 minutes ago, you were lecturing me about my poor life choices and my lack of ambition. Now you're crying because you're realizing what those poor choices have cost you professionally and socially. You're not upset because you hurt me, Delilah. You're upset because you hurt yourself." The accuracy of my observation hit like a physical blow. Delilah's tears stopped abruptly, replaced by a look of shock that suggested she'd never heard me speak to her this way before. "Because I never had. You systematically sabotaged opportunities that were offered to me based on my own merits," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. "You convinced me that invitations from prestigious organizations were mistakes. You told influential people that I wasn't worth their time. And you did all of this while positioning yourself as my protector." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Tasha, maybe." "No, Bradley," I said, turning to include him in my gaze. "You don't get to maybe this away either. How many times have you watched Delilah tear me down and said nothing? How many times have you all just accepted that this is how our family works? That Delilah gets to be the successful one, and I get to be the one who needs managing?" The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the shocked quiet of people processing unexpected information. This was the uncomfortable silence of people being forced to examine their own complicity, in a dynamic they'd preferred not to think about too closely. "I have a master's degree from one of the most prestigious education programs in the state," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I've been nominated for Teacher of the Year 3 times. I've published articles on innovative teaching methods in professional journals. I speak 3 languages fluently, and I volunteer with literacy programs in underserved communities." Thomas nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming what I suspected, that Alexander's people had done thorough research on my background and accomplishments long before any of these social organizations had. "But none of that mattered to any of you," I continued, because Delilah decided it didn't matter. And I was so used to deferring to her judgment that I started to believe it myself. Dad cleared his throat. "Natasha, we never meant—" "Yes, you did," I said, but without anger. "Maybe not consciously, but you absolutely meant it. You all decided that Delilah was the ambitious one, the successful one, the one whose opinions carried weight. And I was the sweet, naive one who needed guidance and protection from the real world." Alexander was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not surprise, exactly, but something like recognition, as if he was seeing a version of me that he'd known existed but had been waiting for me to discover. "You want to know what's really ironic?" I asked, looking around the table at my family. "I didn't marry Alex for his money. I didn't even know who he was when we first met. We met at a literacy fundraiser where I was volunteering, and he was there representing his foundation's educational initiatives. We talked for 3 hours about teaching methods and childhood development before he ever mentioned what he did for a living." "That's impossible," Delilah said automatically. "Everyone knows who Alexander Ashworth is." "No," Alexander said quietly. "Everyone in your circles knows who I am. Most people have never heard of me, which is exactly how I prefer it. When I met Natasha, she saw me as someone who cared about the same things she did, not as a business opportunity or a social advancement. And when he told me who he really was," I continued, "my first instinct was to run, because I knew that being with him would mean dealing with exactly this, people questioning my motives, assuming I was a gold digger, treating me differently based on his bank account rather than my own character." "But you married him anyway," Bradley observed. "I married him because he convinced me that we could build a life together that honored both of our values," I said. "A life where my work as a teacher mattered as much as his work as a CEO, where we could use our resources to make a difference without turning our relationship into a public spectacle." I looked directly at Delilah again, "and where I could maintain relationships with my family based on genuine connection rather than financial manipulation." "I never manipulated," Delilah started to protest. "You absolutely did," I cut her off. "Every time you made me feel guilty for not being more ambitious. Every time you suggested that my career choices were holding me back from real success. Every time you positioned yourself as the expert on what I should or shouldn't do with my life. That's manipulation, Delilah." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Ashworth, if I may, the foundation boards that were interested in your participation, they're meeting next week to finalize their annual membership selections." The implication was clear. Despite Delilah's interference, there might still be time to repair some of the damage that had been done. "What are you saying?" Delilah asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. "I'm saying," I replied, taking charge of the conversation for perhaps the first time in my adult life, "that it's time for me to start speaking for myself. No more hiding behind secrecy and no more allowing other people to make decisions about what I'm capable of or worthy of." I turned to Alexander. "I want to accept those board positions. All of them. And I want to use our resources to support the kind of educational initiatives I've always cared about." Alexander's smile was warm and proud. "I was hoping you'd say that." "But first," I said, looking back at my family, "we need to establish some new ground rules for how we're going to relate to each other going forward." Dad straightened in his chair, his principal instincts recognizing the shift in family dynamics. "What kind of ground rules?" The kind where my choices are mine to make, I said firmly, where my marriage is mine to define, and where my relationship with each of you is based on mutual respect rather than anyone's assumptions about what I can or should be doing with my life. Mom looked around the table uncertainly. Of course, sweetheart, we all want that. Do you? I asked, because I think we're about to find out. Delilah was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. You're really not going to forgive me, are you? I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen, I said. And I'm not going to go back to letting you treat me like a child who needs your approval for major life decisions. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it's going to have to be between equals. The word hung in the air between us. Equals. It was probably the first time I had ever used that word to describe what I wanted from my relationship with my sister. And from the look on her face, it was clear that the concept was as foreign to her as it had been transformative for me. The aftermath of my declaration settled over the picnic table like dust after an explosion. For several long moments, nobody seemed to know quite what to say or do. I remained standing, feeling simultaneously empowered and terrified by what I'd just unleashed. This was uncharted territory for all of us. It was Alexander who broke the silence, rising smoothly from his seat to stand beside me. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a physical demonstration of support that didn't go unnoticed by anyone at the table. I think, he said diplomatically, that this might be a good time for Natasha and me to take a walk. Give everyone a chance to process what's been discussed. That's probably wise, Dad said quietly, his principal's instincts recognizing when a situation needed space to cool down before productive conversation could resume. But as Alexander and I turned to leave, Thomas spoke up. Mrs. Ashworth, before you go, there are some people you should probably be aware of. He gestured discreetly toward the parking area, where I could see 2 additional black vehicles that hadn't been there before. Standing near them were several individuals in dark suits who were trying very hard to look like they weren't watching our family gathering. Security? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Alexander's expression tightened slightly. When I changed my travel plans unexpectedly, protocol required additional measures. I apologize. I should have mentioned it sooner. The sight of the security detail was apparently the final straw for whatever composure Delilah had managed to regain. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Security detail, she repeated faintly. My sister needs a security detail. The security isn't for me, I said, looking back at her. It's standard procedure for Alex. But you're right, this is my life now. This is what I chose when I married him. Uncle Raymond, who had been quietly absorbing everything, finally found his voice. How do you handle it? The attention, the pressure, the constant scrutiny? It was a fair question, and one that got to the heart of why we'd maintained our secrecy for so long. Most of the time, we don't deal with it, I admitted. Alex is very private, and I've been able to maintain my normal routine because no one knew who I was married to. But that's obviously about to change. Thomas cleared his throat. Actually, Mrs. Ashworth, there are some things we should discuss about that. Mr. Ashworth's appearance here today will likely generate some interest. What kind of interest? Mom asked, worry creeping into her voice. Alexander and Thomas exchanged a look that suggested this was a conversation they'd had before. The kind where people noticed that Alexander Ashworth attended a family gathering at a public park, Thomas explained carefully. The kind where someone might connect Natasha Carmichael, elementary school teacher, with Natasha Ashworth, wife of a billionaire. You mean reporters, Bradley said, understanding immediately. Among others, Thomas confirmed, business competitors, social media, local news outlets. Mr. Ashworth's personal life is generally considered off-limits, but a public appearance like this changes the calculation. I felt a chill run down my spine. In all my concerns about keeping our marriage secret from my family, I hadn't fully considered the implications of eventually going public. Alexander had tried to explain it to me before, but the reality was more daunting than I'd imagined. "What does that mean for Natasha's job?" Dad asked, his protective instincts kicking in. "For her students?" "It means," Alexander said quietly, "that we need to be very strategic about how we handle the next few weeks. Natasha's privacy and her ability to continue teaching are my top priorities." Aunt Priscilla leaned forward. "Is she in danger?" "Not danger, exactly," Thomas replied. "But there will definitely be increased attention. People will want to know about her background, her family, her work. There may be photographers outside her school, reporters trying to interview her colleagues and students' parents." The weight of what was happening began to settle on me. I had spent 2 years living a double life to avoid exactly this scenario, and now it was happening anyway. Not because of a planned revelation, but because of a family crisis that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. "I can handle it," I said, though my voice sounded less certain than I'd intended. "You won't have to handle it alone," Alexander said firmly. "We'll need to coordinate with the school administration, brief your principal about what to expect, possibly arrange alternative security measures for the building." "This is insane," Delilah said quietly. "This whole situation is completely insane." "It's complicated," I corrected, "but it's not insane. This is what happens when you marry someone in the public eye. I knew that going in." "Did you?" Mom asked gently. "Really?" The question made me pause. Had I really understood what I was signing up for when I married Alexander? I'd known intellectually that his wealth and prominence came with complications. But experiencing those complications firsthand was different from anticipating them. "I'm learning," I admitted, "and I'm going to need help." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach. We already have protocols in place for situations like this. The key is acting quickly and decisively." "What kind of protocols?" Bradley asked. "Media management, security coordination, privacy protection," Thomas explained. "We'll work with Mrs. Ashworth's school to ensure minimal disruption to her teaching schedule. We'll provide security as needed, and we'll handle any press inquiries through official channels." Alexander turned to address my family directly. "I also want you all to know that you may be contacted by reporters or photographers. They'll want to know about Natasha's childhood, her relationship with all of you, details about today's gathering." "What should we tell them?" Mom asked. "Nothing," Thomas said immediately, politely declined to comment and refer them to our official spokesperson. "Don't confirm or deny anything. Don't speculate about Mrs. Ashworth's motivations or feelings, and absolutely don't provide any personal details or family photographs." The serious tone of his instructions seemed to drive home the reality of our situation for everyone at the table. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. It was about managing a public relations situation that could have lasting consequences for everyone involved. "I should call the school," I said, suddenly realizing that my principal needed to be warned about what might be coming. "Already handled," Alexander said. "Jonathan contacted Dr. Martinez this morning to brief her on the situation. She's being very supportive and has agreed to coordinate with our security team." "You called my principal?" I asked, feeling a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty about how much of my professional life was being managed without my direct input. "We called to give her advance warning and to offer resources," Alexander clarified. "But you'll need to speak with her personally to discuss how you want to handle this going forward." Uncle Raymond was shaking his head slowly. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me this is all an elaborate joke." "It's not a joke," I said, "but it's also not a tragedy. Yes, our lives are about to become more complicated. Yes, there will be attention and scrutiny that we're not used to. But Alex and I will figure it out together." "And what about us?" Delilah asked quietly. "What about your relationship with your family?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because I honestly didn't know the answer. "That depends," I said carefully, "on whether you can accept that I'm not the same person I was this morning. I'm not going back to being the little sister who needs protection from her own poor judgment. I'm not going back to deferring to your opinions about what I should or shouldn't do with my life. But we're still family, Mom said, her voice carrying a note of pleading. Yes, I agreed, we're still family, but we're going to have to figure out what that means under these new circumstances. Thomas checked his watch discreetly. Mrs. Ashworth, I hate to interrupt, but we should probably begin moving toward next steps. The longer we remain here, the greater the chance that someone will notice and begin asking questions. Alexander nodded. You're right. We should head home so Natasha can process everything that's happened, and we can start planning for what comes next. As we began gathering our things, I looked around at my family, still seated at the picnic table, still processing the complete upheaval of everything they thought they knew about me and my life. This isn't how I wanted this to happen, I told them. I'd hoped we could find a gentler way to navigate this transition. But it is happening, Dad said, standing to give me a hug, and we'll figure out how to support you, even if we don't fully understand it yet. His words, simple and direct, felt like the first step toward building something new from the ruins of our old family dynamic. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but at least it felt possible. The ride home in Alexander's actual car, a sleek silver Bentley that had been waiting beyond the park's main entrance, felt surreal after the morning's revelations. Thomas drove while Alexander and I sat in the back seat, the silence between us heavy with unspoken questions and concerns. How much did you know? I asked finally, breaking the quiet as we wound through Silverton's tree-lined streets. Alexander turned to face me, his expression careful. About what, specifically? About Delilah. About what she'd been doing. About the opportunities I'd missed because of her interference. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his response. More than you might expect, less than you probably think. That's not an answer, Alex. When we first started dating, I had you investigated, he said quietly. It's standard practice for anyone who becomes close to me. I need to know if people have ulterior motives, if they're being truthful about their backgrounds, if there are security risks. The admission stung, even though I understood the logic behind it. And what did your investigation reveal? That you were exactly who you appeared to be, he said immediately, a dedicated teacher, well regarded by your colleagues and students' families, with an impressive academic background and a genuine passion for education. But? Thomas cleared his throat from the front seat. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued at home where we have more privacy. He was right, but I needed to know now. Tell me what else you found. Alexander sighed. We found evidence that you'd been contacted by several prominent organizations and had declined to participate. At first we assumed it was because you were naturally private or perhaps overwhelmed by your teaching responsibilities. But when the pattern continued, even after we were married, I asked for a more detailed investigation. My stomach clenched. What kind of pattern? Invitations that were never responded to, board positions that were offered and then quietly rescinded when the organizations received no reply, networking events where you were expected but never appeared, with no explanation given. The picture he was painting was even worse than what had been revealed at the family gathering. How many opportunities? At least a dozen over the past 3 years, Alexander said gently, some of them quite significant. The Regional Education Council offered you a consulting position last year. The governor's task force on childhood literacy specifically requested your participation. The National Teaching Excellence Foundation wanted to feature you in their annual publication. Each revelation felt like a physical blow. These weren't just local social organizations. These were professional opportunities that could have advanced my career and amplified my voice in educational policy discussions. Did you know Delilah was behind it? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. We suspected family interference, Thomas said from the driver's seat. The investigation revealed that someone claiming to speak on your behalf had been declining invitations and discouraging follow-up contact. When we traced the communications, they all led back to your sister. You've been watching my family? We've been protecting you, Alexander corrected. There's a difference. When it became clear that someone in your inner circle was actively sabotaging your professional opportunities, we had to understand the scope and motivation. We pulled into the circular driveway of the Pemberton estate, my home, though I still sometimes felt like a guest there. The sprawling Georgian mansion was beautiful, but intimidating, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens that employed a full-time staff of 6. As we walked through the front door, I was struck by the contrast between this morning's modest family gathering and the quiet luxury that surrounded me here. Crystal chandeliers, original artwork, furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. This was the life Delilah had thought I was too unsophisticated to appreciate. "There's more you need to know," Alexander said as we settled in his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Thomas opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the coffee table. "These are copies of communications we intercepted over the past 18 months. I leaned forward to examine the papers, my confusion growing as I read. These weren't just declinations of invitations. They were character assessments, professional evaluations that painted me as unsuitable for various positions and responsibilities. "This one is from 6 months ago," Thomas explained, pointing to an email. "Your sister contacted the Hartwell Foundation after they'd extended an invitation for you to join their education committee. She told them that you were, quote, some personal difficulties and weren't in a position to take on additional responsibilities." Personal difficulties? I read the email again, hardly believing what I was seeing. "What personal difficulties?" "According to this," Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "you were dealing with financial stress and marital problems that were affecting your professional judgment." The room spun slightly as the implications sank in. She told them I was having marital problems? She painted a picture of someone who was struggling to maintain basic stability, Thomas continued. Someone who might be unreliable or potentially embarrassing to be associated with. I grabbed another document from the pile. This one was a phone call transcript from the Museum Guild. Delilah had apparently called them personally to explain that I was going through a difficult period and wouldn't be able to participate in their programming for the foreseeable future. "How many organizations did she contact directly?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "At least 8 that we've documented," Thomas replied. In each case, she positioned herself as a concerned family member who was trying to protect both you and the organization from an awkward situation. "She was protecting herself," I said, the pattern becoming crystal clear. "She couldn't risk me succeeding in those circles because it would expose how wrong she'd been about my capabilities." Alexander nodded grimly. "That's our assessment as well. But there's something else you need to see." He pulled out another document, this one marked with the letterhead of a prestigious consulting firm. 3 months ago, Delilah hired Whitman and Associates to conduct a quote, discreet background check on you. She had me investigated? She wanted to find out if there was anything in your past that she could use to justify her concerns to these organizations, Thomas explained. She was looking for financial problems, professional misconduct, anything that would validate her claims about your unsuitability. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic that I felt physically ill. "What did they find?" "Nothing," Alexander said simply. "Your background is impeccable. Excellent credit, sterling professional reputation, no legal issues, no scandals. The investigators concluded that you were exactly what you appeared to be, a highly qualified educator with an exemplary personal and professional record." But Delilah didn't accept that conclusion, Thomas continued. She asked them to dig deeper, to look for hidden problems or character flaws that might not be immediately apparent. I stared at the documents spread across the table, evidence of a level of betrayal I never could have imagined. My own sister paid strangers to find dirt on me so she could justify sabotaging my career. When they found nothing, she became more aggressive in her direct outreach to organizations, Alexander said. The communications became more detailed, more specific in their allegations about your supposed problems. Show me, I said, though I wasn't sure I could handle seeing more. Thomas hesitated, then pulled out a final folder. These are from the past 6 weeks, after you and Alexander returned from your anniversary trip to Europe. The timing wasn't coincidental. Delilah had noticed that I'd taken a luxurious vacation, and it had triggered a new wave of sabotage. This email is to the Symphony Guild, Thomas said, pointing to a printed message. She told them that you'd recently started displaying signs of quote, grandiose behavior and unrealistic expectations about your social status that suggested you might not be a good fit for their organization. Grandiose behavior, I repeated numbly. This one is to the Children's Hospital Foundation, he continued. She suggested that your recent extravagant spending habits indicated poor judgment that could reflect badly on their fundraising efforts. Each revelation was worse than the last. Delilah hadn't just been declining opportunities on my behalf. She'd been actively destroying my reputation in professional and philanthropic circles throughout the region. How many people know about this? I asked. That's the good news, Alexander said. Most of these organizations kept her communications confidential. They didn't spread the allegations, partly out of professional discretion, and partly because many of them seemed suspicious of the claims. Suspicious how? Several organizations contacted your school directly to verify information, Thomas explained. When they spoke with your principal and colleagues, the picture they got of you didn't match what your sister was telling them, so they held off on making any final decisions about your applications. Which means, Alexander concluded, that most of these opportunities are still available if you want to pursue them. The damage isn't irreversible, but we need to act quickly to set the record straight. I looked around the study, with its walls of law books and business texts, its expensive furnishings and obvious markers of wealth and success. This was the world Delilah had thought I wasn't worthy of, the life she'd actively worked to prevent me from accessing. I want to pursue them, I said firmly. All of them, and I want everyone to know exactly what happened and why. Are you sure? Alexander asked gently. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Your privacy, your family relationships, your quiet life, all of that changes permanently. It's already changed, I replied. The only question now is whether I'm going to let Delilah's version of me define my future, or whether I'm going to show these organizations who I really am. Thomas began gathering the documents. Then we have a lot of work to do. The next morning, I stood in front of my walk-in closet, a space larger than my entire apartment had been before marriage, and realized I had no idea how to dress for reclaiming my life. The modest teacher wardrobe that had served me well for years suddenly felt like a costume I'd outgrown, but the expensive designer clothes Alexander had bought me felt like someone else's skin. Having a fashion crisis, Alexander asked from the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Having an identity crisis, I corrected, accepting the coffee gratefully. I don't know who I'm supposed to be today. You're supposed to be yourself, he said simply. The woman who convinced me to fall in love with her doesn't need a costume. But that was the problem. I wasn't entirely sure who that woman was anymore. For so long, I'd defined myself in opposition to Delilah's expectations, making choices that were deliberately modest, deliberately unremarkable. Now, faced with the opportunity to step fully into the life I'd been living in secret, I felt paralyzed by possibilities. My phone rang, startling me from my wardrobe crisis. The caller ID showed Dr. Martinez, my principal, and I answered immediately. Natasha, her familiar voice was warm but concerned. I wanted to call before the morning news cycle gets going. Are you prepared for what's coming? What do you mean? Check the Silverton Tribune's website. The story broke about an hour ago. With a sinking feeling, I opened my laptop and navigated to the local paper's homepage. The headline made my stomach drop. Billionaire tech CEO's secret wife, local teacher lived double life for years. Oh no, I breathed, scanning the article. It was surprisingly accurate, which meant someone with real information had talked to the reporter. The piece detailed Alexander's surprise appearance at, quote, a family gathering, described me as an elementary school educator who has kept her marriage to one of the region's wealthiest men completely private, and included several quotes from sources familiar with the situation. The good news, Dr. Martinez continued, is that the article paints you in a very positive light. It emphasizes your dedication to teaching and your professional accomplishments. But Natasha, there are already 3 news vans in our school parking lot. The reality of what Alexander and Thomas had warned me about was already happening. What should I do? Well, you have several options. You can take a personal day and let this blow over. You can come in through the staff entrance and try to avoid the cameras. Or, she paused dramatically, or you can walk through the front door with your head high and show everyone exactly who you are. Personally, I'd recommend the latter. You have nothing to be ashamed of, and your students deserve to see their teacher handling adversity with grace. After ending the call, I looked back at my closet with new clarity. I didn't need to dress like someone else. I needed to dress like the best version of myself, professional, confident, but still authentically me. I selected a navy blue dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, paired it with the pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and added a blazer that suggested authority without arrogance. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I recognized, a teacher who happened to be married to a billionaire, not a billionaire's wife who happened to teach. Perfect, Alexander said when I emerged from the closet. You look like yourself. Thomas was waiting in the kitchen with a briefing folder. Mrs. Ashworth, we've prepared responses to the most likely questions you'll encounter today. The key is to stay focused on your work and your students rather than personal details. What about the organizations Delilah sabotaged? Should I address that publicly? Not yet, Alexander advised. Let's handle those conversations privately first. Today is about establishing that you're still the same dedicated teacher you've always been, regardless of who you're married to. The drive to Maplewood Elementary felt like traveling to a different planet. Thomas had to navigate around news vans and cameramen who were clearly hoping for a dramatic arrival. Instead, I stepped out of the modest Honda we'd borrowed from the estate's service fleet, waved politely to the gathered media, and walked confidently toward the school's main entrance. Mrs. Ashworth! Mrs. Ashworth! The shouted questions came from all directions. How long have you been married to Alexander Ashworth? Why did you keep your marriage secret? Will you continue teaching now that your wealth is public? I paused at the school's front door and turned to address the cameras. My name is Natasha Ashworth, and I am a 3rd-grade teacher here at Maplewood Elementary. I love my job, I love my students, and that hasn't changed. I'm here to teach, just like I am every day. Thank you. The response was simple, direct, and completely authentic. As I walked through the familiar hallways of my school, greeting colleagues who looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete alignment between who I was privately and who I was publicly. Room 127 is going to be very exciting today, my teaching assistant, Mrs. Chen, said with a grin. The kids have been buzzing about the news vans since they arrived. How much do they understand? Enough to know their teacher is famous, not enough to understand why. 3rd graders have a refreshingly simple view of the world. She was right. When I entered my classroom, 22 8-year-old faces looked up at me with the same mixture of excitement and affection they showed every morning. To them, I was still just Mrs. Ashworth, the teacher who made math fun and read stories with different voices for each character. Mrs. Ashworth, Lily Patterson raised her hand eagerly. My mom said you're married to someone really important. Does that mean you're a princess now? The innocent question made me smile. No, sweetie, I'm not a princess. I'm still your teacher, and that's the most important job I could have." "But you could buy a castle if you wanted to," observed Marcus Thompson with 8-year-old logic. "I suppose I could," I agreed, "but I'd much rather be here with all of you, learning about fractions and reading about brave characters in our books." The day proceeded with surprising normalcy. Yes, there were interruptions. Phone calls from reporters that Dr. Martinez fielded, curious glances from colleagues, and the constant awareness of media presence outside. But, in my classroom, surrounded by my students, I remembered why I'd fought so hard to keep this part of my life authentic. During lunch, Dr. Martinez joined me in my classroom. "I've had some interesting phone calls today." "More reporters?" "Some, but also Rebecca Whitmore, Linda Pemberton, and the superintendent. All of them wanting to express their support and their interest in discussing some opportunities with you." I set down my sandwich. "What kind of opportunities?" "The superintendent wants to talk about a district-wide position developing innovative teaching methods. Rebecca Whitmore mentioned something about the Hartwell Foundation reconsidering your application. And Linda Pemberton," Dr. Martinez smiled mysteriously, "she wants to invite you to lunch to discuss, quote, mutual interests in educational philanthropy." The irony wasn't lost on me. The very opportunities Delilah had sabotaged were now being offered again, but from a position of strength rather than supplication. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "Channel 7 wants to do a feature story about the billionaire's wife who chose to keep teaching. They're interested in highlighting your commitment to public education despite having other options." A feature story? Think about it, Natasha. You have a platform now that most educators never get. You could use that visibility to advocate for teachers, for funding, for educational policy. Your voice could carry real weight in discussions that matter. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent years avoiding attention, and now I was being offered the chance to use attention as a tool for causes I cared about. After school, as I walked past the remaining news crews toward the car where Thomas waited, I felt a profound sense of transformation. Not because I'd become someone different, but because I'd finally become fully myself. No longer hiding parts of my identity, no longer allowing others to define my worth or my capabilities. My phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Saw the news coverage. You were magnificent. Dinner at home? We have much to celebrate." As Thomas drove me home through the familiar streets of Silverton, I realized that this morning's terrifying prospect of exposure had become something else entirely: liberation. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to choose between different versions of myself. I could be both the dedicated teacher and the philanthropist's wife, both the woman who valued modest authenticity and the person who could afford to make a difference on a larger scale. The secret was out, but instead of feeling vulnerable, I felt powerful. Instead of feeling exposed, I felt free. 3 days after the news broke, our dining room had been transformed into a war room. The mahogany table that usually hosted elegant dinner parties was now covered with legal documents, media clippings, organizational charts, and strategic planning materials. Alexander's business attorney, Margaret Holbrook, sat across from Thomas and me, while Jonathan participated via video conference from the downtown office. "The response has been overwhelmingly positive," Margaret reported, consulting her tablet. 73% favorable coverage across all media platforms. The narrative has solidified around dedicated teacher chooses service over luxury, which is exactly what we hoped for. I looked at the stack of newspaper clippings and printed articles spread before me. Headlines like "The Billionaire's Wife Who Stayed in the Classroom" and "Modest Millionaire, Local Teacher's Secret Marriage Shocks Community" dominated the coverage. "What about the negative 27%? I asked. "Predictable criticism," Thomas replied. "Some questioning your motives for keeping the marriage secret, a few suggesting you were deceiving your students and colleagues. Nothing that damages your core reputation." Jonathan's voice came through the laptop speakers. More importantly, we've had 47 direct inquiries from organizations wanting to discuss partnerships, board positions, or collaborative projects. That's more interest than most public figures generate in an entire year. Alexander leaned forward, reviewing a separate set of documents. Have you been able to contact all the organizations that Delilah interfered with? Most of them, Margaret confirmed. The responses have been remarkably consistent. Once we explained the situation and provided documentation of the interference, every organization expressed interest in reconsidering their invitations. She pulled out a specific folder. The Hartwell Foundation wants to offer you not just the committee position you were originally invited to join, but the vice chair role for their education initiative. The Museum Guild is asking if you'd consider chairing their new public education outreach program. And the Governor's Task Force on Childhood Literacy has extended an invitation to serve as their private sector liaison. The scope of opportunities being offered was overwhelming. 6 months ago, I'd been declined for basic committee memberships. Now I was being courted for leadership positions. There's something else, Jonathan added. We've received a formal request from the State Department of Education. They want to discuss appointing you to the statewide Education Innovation Council. The state level? I asked, struggling to process the magnitude of what was being offered. It gets better, Alexander said with a slight smile. The National Education Association wants to feature you as their keynote speaker at next year's conference. The theme is Education as Public Service, and they specifically want to highlight your choice to remain in the classroom. Thomas opened another folder. We've also had inquiries from 3 different universities about guest lecturing positions, 2 book publishers interested in education-focused memoirs, and a documentary production company that wants to follow you through a typical school year. The attention was flattering, but also somewhat daunting. I don't want to become a celebrity, I said carefully. I want to use this platform to make a real difference, not just to be famous. Which brings us to strategy, Margaret said, pulling out a thick planning document. We need to be very selective about which opportunities align with your actual goals and values. She spread out a chart that mapped various organizations and opportunities according to impact potential, time commitment, and alignment with my educational priorities. The key is building a portfolio of commitments that amplify each other, she explained. For example, serving on the Hartwell Foundation board gives you insight into funding priorities that you can then address through your work with the State Education Council. Your classroom experience informs your policy recommendations, which enhance your credibility as a speaker and consultant. Jonathan's voice cut through the planning session. We should also discuss the family situation. We've been monitoring communications, and there have been some developments. My stomach clenched. What kind of developments? Thomas pulled out his phone and opened a recording app. Delilah has been contacted by several media outlets. She's declined most interviews, but yesterday she spoke with Sarah Chen from Channel 7. What did she say? He pressed play, and my sister's voice filled the room through the phone's speaker. I just want people to understand that Natasha has always been extraordinary. I think I made some mistakes in trying to protect her privacy, but her heart has always been in the right place. She's genuinely dedicated to her students and to education, and that's what matters most. The statement was carefully worded, clearly coached, and notably absent of any admission of wrongdoing. She's trying to control the narrative, I observed. Successfully so far, Margaret confirmed. The interview positioned her as a protective older sister who may be overstepped, but with good intentions. It's actually helping your image, making you look gracious for not throwing her under the bus publicly. Alexander frowned, but it's not the whole truth. No, I agreed, but it might be enough truth for now. I don't need Delilah to be publicly destroyed for me to move forward. Jonathan's voice came through again. There's another family development. Your parents contacted our office directly. They want to schedule a meeting to discuss how they can best support your new public role. This surprised me. Since the reunion, I'd heard from Mom and Dad only through brief, careful text messages that suggested they were still processing everything that had happened. What kind of support are they thinking about? I asked. Media management, public appearances, that sort of thing, Thomas replied. Your father specifically mentioned that his experience in education administration might be helpful as you navigate these new opportunities. The gesture felt significant. Dad offering his professional expertise rather than just parental support suggested he was beginning to see me as a peer rather than just his daughter. There's one more thing we need to address, Margaret said, her tone becoming more serious. The financial disclosure requirements for some of these positions. She pulled out another set of documents. Several of the board positions you're being offered require public disclosure of assets and potential conflicts of interest. Given Alexander's business interests, this could get complicated. Alexander leaned back in his chair. How complicated? While the Hartwell Foundation receives significant donations from tech companies, the Education Innovation Council advises on technology integration in schools. If you're serving in leadership roles while married to someone who could benefit from the policies you're helping to shape. The implication was clear. My new public role came with scrutiny not just of my own actions, but of Alexander's business interests and how they might intersect with my educational advocacy. We'll need to establish clear ethical guidelines, I said. Complete transparency about potential conflicts, recusal from relevant decisions, whatever it takes to ensure there's no question about my motivations. That's exactly the right approach, Margaret approved. In fact, proactive transparency could become part of your public brand, the advocate who goes above and beyond to ensure ethical behavior. Thomas consulted his notes. Speaking of transparency, we've prepared responses to the most likely questions you'll face in upcoming interviews and public appearances. The key themes are authenticity, service, and using privilege responsibly. Over the next hour, we rehearsed potential interview scenarios, discussed strategic priorities for the various board positions, and mapped out a timeline for public appearances and commitments. The level of coordination required was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, but it felt purposeful rather than overwhelming. One final item, Jonathan said as we began wrapping up. The Channel 7 feature story airs tomorrow night. They've put together a very compelling piece about your choice to continue teaching. It includes interviews with your students' parents, your colleagues, and Dr. Martinez. No family interviews? I asked. We declined those, Alexander said. This story needs to be about your professional choices and your dedication to education, not family drama or personal relationships. As the meeting concluded and our advisors began packing up their materials, I looked around the dining room that had served as mission control for planning my public life. The transformation felt symbolic, a private space converted for strategic purposes, just like my private life was being converted into a platform for public service. Are you ready for this? Alexander asked after everyone else had left. I considered the question seriously. A week ago, I'd been a teacher with a secret. Now I was becoming a public figure with responsibilities that extended far beyond my classroom. The transition was happening faster than I'd ever imagined possible, but it felt right in a way that surprised me. I think I am, I said. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The Channel 7 feature story had aired the previous evening to widespread acclaim, painting a compelling portrait of a woman who chose purpose over privilege. This morning, however, brought an unexpected visitor to our estate's front gate, Delilah, arriving unannounced in her luxury sedan, demanding to speak with me. I watched through the security monitor as she argued with the gate attendant, her gestures becoming increasingly agitated when told she couldn't simply drive up to the house without an appointment. After 20 minutes of this standoff, I made a decision that surprised even myself. Let her in, I told Thomas. It's time we finished this conversation. Alexander looked up from his breakfast and the morning papers, which featured my story prominently. Are you sure? We don't have any backup planned for this scenario. I don't need backup, I said, surprised by my own confidence. I need to face my sister as an equal, not from behind a wall of handlers and security protocols. When Delilah finally entered our morning room, her appearance shocked me. Always impeccably groomed, She now looked haggard. Her usual perfect makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her designer outfit seemed to hang loose on her frame as if she'd lost weight. "My God, Natasha," she breathed, taking in the room's casual elegance. Fresh flowers from our greenhouse, morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, breakfast served on china that cost more than most people's car payments. You really live like this every day. "Good morning, Delilah," I said evenly. "Would you like some coffee?" She accepted the offer and sat down across from Alexander and me, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the delicate porcelain cup. For several moments, none of us spoke, the silence heavy with unresolved tension. "I saw the news story," she finally said. "It was very flattering." "It was honest," I corrected. "There's a difference." Delilah's laugh was bitter. "Honest, right. Was it honest when you failed to mention that you've been living in a $47 million mansion while lecturing me about financial responsibility?" "I never lectured you about anything," I pointed out. "I listened while you lectured me. That's not how I remember it." Alexander cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should give you two some privacy." "No," I said firmly. "Stay. Delilah came here knowing you'd be present. This conversation involves all of us." Delilah's eyes narrowed. "Actually, I came here because my phone hasn't stopped ringing for 3 days. Do you know what it's like to have reporters calling your office, asking about your relationship with your billionaire sister? Do you understand what this has done to my reputation?" "Your reputation?" I repeated, incredulous. "You're concerned about your reputation?" "I'm concerned about my business," Delilah snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Half my clients have called to ask why I never mentioned my connection to the Ashworth family. They want to know if I can get them invitations to your charity galas, if I can arrange meetings with Alexander's business associates. The other half think I've been hiding assets or lying about my own financial situation." I stared at her, beginning to understand the real reason for her visit. "You want me to help you leverage my marriage for your business." "I want you to fix what you've broken," she exploded. "For 2 years you've let me make a fool of myself, talking about your modest lifestyle while you were living like royalty. Do you know how that makes me look? Do you know what people are saying about me?" Alexander leaned forward slightly. "What exactly are people saying?" Delilah's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. That I'm either incredibly naive or a pathological liar. That I couldn't recognize wealth when it was right in front of me. Linda Pemberton actually asked me at the country club yesterday if I was, quote, cognitively impaired, for not realizing my own sister was married to Alexander Ashworth. The admission hung in the air, revealing the depth of Delilah's humiliation. Her entire social and professional identity had been built on being the connected, successful sister who understood how the world really worked. Now she was being publicly portrayed as someone who couldn't even recognize success in her own family. "I'm sorry people are questioning your judgment," I said carefully, "but I'm not responsible for fixing the consequences of your actions." "My actions?" Delilah's voice rose to near hysteria. "What actions? Being a good sister? Trying to protect you from situations where you'd be embarrassed or out of your depth?" "Sabotaging my career opportunities," I said flatly. "Lying to prestigious organizations about my character and capabilities. Having me investigated by private detectives. Systematically undermining my reputation in professional circles." Delilah went very still. "What are you talking about?" I nodded to Alexander, who pulled out the folder we'd prepared for this moment. "We have documentation of everything, Delilah. Every phone call, every email, every conversation where you told organizations I was unsuitable for membership or participation." As Alexander spread the evidence across the table, I watched my sister's face cycle through denial, shock, and finally recognition. She picked up one of the transcripts with shaking hands. "This is from my conversation with the Museum Guild," she whispered. Where you told them I was having financial difficulties and marital problems, I confirmed, none of which was true. I was trying to save you from embarrassment. You were saving yourself from having to admit you'd been wrong about me, I interrupted. Every successful opportunity I might have had threatened your narrative about who was the accomplished sister and who needed protection. Delilah's face crumpled as she continued reading through the evidence. I never meant. I thought I was helping. No, you didn't, Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying an edge I rarely heard. According to our investigation, you escalated your interference after Natasha and I returned from Europe. You saw signs that her lifestyle was changing, and instead of asking questions, you tried to destroy her reputation to maintain your own superiority. That's not true. Then explain this, I said, pulling out the final piece of evidence. The private investigator's report Delilah had commissioned. You paid strangers to find dirt on me so you could justify your sabotage to yourself and others. The report landed on the table between us like a bomb. Delilah stared at it, her remaining defenses crumbling. They found nothing, she said numbly. Because there was nothing to find, I replied. I was exactly who I appeared to be, a dedicated teacher with an exemplary record. But you couldn't accept that, could you? You needed me to have hidden flaws that would validate your treatment of me. Delilah's hands covered her face, and for a moment she looked very young and very lost. Everyone's going to know. The investigation will come out, the phone calls will be exposed. My career is over. Not necessarily, Alexander said, surprising both of us. We have no intention of releasing this information unless legally required to do so. Delilah looked up hopefully. You won't tell anyone? We don't need to tell anyone, I said. The truth is already apparent to the people who matter. The organizations you contacted are intelligent enough to put the pieces together. Your reputation will be determined by how you handle yourself going forward, not by our actions. What does that mean? I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment. It means you have a choice, Delilah. You can continue trying to leverage our family connection for your business advantage. You can keep positioning yourself as the victim of circumstances beyond your control. You can blame me for your humiliation and spend your energy on resentment. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. Or you can take responsibility for your actions, rebuild your reputation through your own merit, and figure out how to have a relationship with me that's based on mutual respect rather than competition and control. The silence that followed was profound. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of the gardening crew working on the rose beds, the normal rhythms of life continuing while we sat in this moment of reckoning. I don't know how to do that, Delilah admitted quietly. I don't know how to be your sister when you're this. You learn, I said simply. The same way I'm learning how to be a public figure while staying true to my values as a teacher. The same way I'm learning to use privilege responsibly instead of hiding from it. Alexander stood up. I think I'll give you two some time to talk through the details. He kissed my forehead gently. Take all the time you need. After he left, Delilah and I sat in the morning room where so many of my major life decisions had been made. Two sisters trying to figure out how to rebuild a relationship that had been built on fundamentally unequal ground. I really did think I was protecting you, she said finally. I know, I replied, but protection without respect isn't love, Delilah, it's control. 6 weeks after Delilah's confrontation in our morning room, I stood at the podium of the Silverton Grand Ballroom, looking out at an audience of 300 influential community leaders gathered for the Hartwell Foundation's annual gala. As the newly appointed vice chair of their education initiative, I was delivering my first major public address, a speech that would establish not just my professional credibility, but the new order of my family's social standing. The transformation had been swift and decisive. In the audience, I could see faces that represented the full spectrum of Silverton's power structure. City council members, university presidents, corporate executives, and philanthropic leaders. 6 months ago, most of these people had never heard my name. Tonight, they were here specifically to hear what I had to say about the future of education in our region. Education is not a privilege to be purchased, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. It is a right to be protected, a foundation to be strengthened, and a legacy to be shared. Tonight I want to talk about how those of us with resources can use them not to create advantage for our own children, but to create opportunity for all children. The applause was immediate and sustained. In the front row, Alexander smiled at me with unmistakable pride. Beside him sat Rebecca Whitmore, who had become an unexpected mentor in navigating philanthropic leadership. 3 tables back, I spotted Linda Pemberton nodding approvingly, the same woman who had once tested Delilah's knowledge of my achievements and found her wanting. What struck me most powerfully was who wasn't in the audience. Delilah had been invited, of course. As my sister, she would always be welcome at events where I was speaking. But she had declined, sending a thoughtful note explaining that she felt it was important for me to establish my own identity in these circles before reintroducing family dynamics. The gesture showed a level of self-awareness and respect that I hadn't expected. 6 weeks ago, I continued, many of you learned about my marriage to Alexander Ashworth through media coverage that focused on the novelty of a billionaire's wife choosing to remain in the classroom. Tonight I want to shift that conversation to focus on why that choice matters and how we can support the educators who make similar choices every day. The speech outlined my vision for the Hartwell Foundation's new Teacher Support Initiative, a program that would provide professional development, classroom resources, and financial assistance to educators working in underfunded schools. It was ambitious, comprehensive, and represented exactly the kind of systematic change I'd always dreamed of influencing. As I spoke, I caught sight of Dr. Martinez in the audience, her presence both supportive and symbolic. Tomorrow, I would be back in my classroom at Maplewood Elementary, teaching 3rd graders about fractions and reading comprehension. The continuity between my philanthropic work and my daily teaching had become a defining feature of my public identity. The goal, I explained to the audience, is not to rescue teachers from public education, but to ensure that public education deserves the teachers we have. When we invest in educators, we invest in every child they will teach throughout their careers. The standing ovation that followed felt different from the polite applause that typically greeted charity gala speeches. This audience understood that they were witnessing the launch of something significant, not just another foundation program, but a new model for how wealth and expertise could be deployed for systemic change. After the speech, the reception buzzed with conversations that would have been unimaginable just 2 months earlier. Mayor Harrison approached me with questions about expanding the teacher support program citywide. The president of Thornfield University wanted to discuss establishing a fellowship program for educators pursuing advanced degrees. Dr. Samuel Chen from the State Education Department, no relation to my teaching assistant, handed me his card with a request to discuss policy recommendations for the upcoming legislative session. "Quite a transformation," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find Linda Pemberton approaching with a slight smile. "I remember asking your sister about you last year. She seemed to think you wouldn't be interested in this kind of work." The comment was delivered with perfectly calibrated diplomacy, acknowledgement of past misunderstanding without unnecessarily embarrassing Delilah or creating awkwardness for me. People's perceptions of what we're capable of don't always match our own understanding, I replied carefully. I'm grateful for the opportunity to show what I'm actually interested in accomplishing. Linda nodded approvingly. Speaking of accomplishments, I have a proposition for you. The Cultural Foundation is launching a new initiative focused on arts education in public schools. Given your success with the teacher support program, we'd like you to consider chairing the committee. The offer represented yet another elevation in responsibility and recognition. 6 months ago, Delilah had convinced organizations like the Cultural Foundation that I wasn't sophisticated enough for basic membership. Now I was being asked to lead their newest initiative. I'd be honored to discuss it, I said, meaning it completely. As the evening progressed, I found myself in increasingly substantive conversations about educational policy, funding strategies, and coalition building. The social skills I developed as a teacher, listening carefully, asking thoughtful questions, building consensus among diverse stakeholders, translated remarkably well to philanthropic leadership. Alexander found me near the end of the reception, as I was exchanging contact information with a group of foundation directors who wanted to explore collaborative programs. "Ready to head home?" he asked, slipping his arm around my waist. "Almost," I said, then addressed the group. "I'll have my assistant coordinate with all of you next week to schedule individual meetings. I want to understand each of your programs before we discuss potential partnerships." As we walked toward the exit, Alexander squeezed my hand. "You were magnificent tonight, completely in your element." "It feels strange to say this," I admitted, "but I think this might actually be my element. The combination of education expertise and philanthropic resources, it's like everything I've learned and experienced has been preparing me for exactly this." In the car on the way home, Thomas provided a briefing on the evening's outcomes. Preliminary commitments totaling $2.3 million for the Teacher Support Initiative. 17 organizations requesting follow-up meetings. 6 media requests for interviews about tonight's announcement. The numbers were gratifying, but what struck me more was the quality of engagement I'd experienced. These weren't people offering perfunctory support for a billionaire's wife's pet project. They were professionals recognizing a peer who brought both expertise and resources to problems they all cared about solving. "There's one more thing," Thomas added. "Your sister called the office this afternoon." I looked up sharply. "About what?" "She wanted to congratulate you on tonight's speech and to request a meeting. Not about family issues," he clarified quickly. "About business. Specifically, she wants to discuss how her real estate expertise might support the foundation's efforts to improve school facilities." The proposal was both surprising and encouraging. Instead of trying to leverage our relationship for her personal benefit, Delilah was offering her professional skills in service of my philanthropic goals. "What did you tell her?" "That you'd consider it and respond directly." As we pulled into our estate's driveway, I reflected on how dramatically the power dynamics in my life had shifted. 2 months ago, I'd been hiding my marriage to avoid exactly the kind of attention and responsibility I'd embraced tonight. I'd been allowing Delilah to speak for me in situations where I should have been speaking for myself. Now I was not only speaking for myself, but being asked to speak for causes and communities that had never had access to the resources I could bring to bear. The transformation felt both surreal and completely natural, as if I'd finally found the right proportion between my capabilities and my opportunities. "Tomorrow's schedule?" I asked Thomas as we reached the front door. "Classroom until 3, foundation board call at 4, interview with the Education Weekly at 5:30. "Perfect," I said, meaning it. The balance between my teaching responsibilities and my philanthropic work had become the defining characteristic of my new life. I wasn't choosing between different identities anymore. I was integrating them in ways that amplified both. As Alexander and I walked through our front door, I realized that tonight had marked more than just a successful speech or a significant fundraising achievement. It had been the moment when my new life fully crystallized, not as a reaction to Delilah's sabotage or Alexander's wealth, but as a positive creation that honored both my values and my opportunities. The victory wasn't just personal, it was the establishment of an entirely new way of being in the world. 1 year later, I stood in the same classroom where my students had first learned about my secret marriage, but everything else had changed in ways I never could have imagined. The morning light streamed through windows that now bore small plaques indicating the room was part of the Ashworth Excellence in Education Wing, a renovation project funded through the Hartwell Foundation that had transformed not just my school, but 12 others throughout the district. "Mrs. Ashworth," 8-year-old Emma Patterson raised her hand eagerly, "My mom says you're going to be on television again tonight. Are you famous now?" I smiled, sitting on the edge of my desk in the casual pose my students had always loved. "What do you think, Emma?" Am I the same teacher I was last year?" "You're the same," piped up Marcus Chen, my teaching assistant's nephew who had joined our class this fall. "But now everybody knows you're really smart about important stuff." From the mouths of babes, Marcus had inadvertently captured what had become my defining philosophy over the past year. Authenticity amplified, not authenticity abandoned. Tonight's television appearance? A national interview on 60 Minutes about innovative approaches to educational philanthropy would be my highest-profile media moment yet. But this morning, like every school morning for the past 7 years, belonged entirely to room 127 and the 23 third graders who still saw me first and foremost as their teacher. "Today we're going to learn about percentages," I announced, projecting a pie chart onto our interactive whiteboard, itself a gift from the Technology in Schools initiative that had grown out of my foundation work. "Can anyone guess what this chart represents?" Hands shot up around the room. "Test scores, pizza slices, money." "It's data about reading improvement in schools that received new library funding," I explained. "And by the end of today's lesson, you'll understand how to read charts like this and why they matter for communities like ours." The integration of real-world applications into basic curriculum had become my signature teaching approach, featured in the educational documentary that would premiere next month. But to my students, it was simply how Mrs. Ashworth made learning interesting. As my students worked through percentage problems based on actual foundation data, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had been transformed. The shy teacher who had hidden her marriage was now a nationally recognized voice in education reform. The woman who had deferred to her sister's judgment about her capabilities was now chairing 3 major foundation initiatives and advising 2 congressional committees on education policy. The door opened quietly, and Dr. Martinez slipped in for her weekly classroom observation, a practice that had evolved from routine evaluation to collaborative consultation as I'd taken on the dual role of practicing teacher and education researcher. "How's the percentages lesson going?" she whispered, settling into the back corner where she could observe without disrupting. "They're getting it," I murmured back. "Real data makes abstract concepts concrete." It was a principle that had guided all my work over the past year. Whether I was presenting funding proposals to foundation boards or testifying before state education committees, I always grounded policy discussions in actual classroom experiences. The credibility that came from still teaching full-time had made me uniquely effective as an advocate. After the students left for lunch, Dr. Martinez and I reviewed the morning's lesson and discussed the research project we were collaborating on, a longitudinal study of teacher retention in schools that received comprehensive support through foundation partnerships. "The preliminary data is remarkable," she said, showing me charts on her tablet. Teacher turnover down 37%, student achievement up 22%, parent engagement increased by half. "This model you've developed is going to revolutionize how we think about educational philanthropy." The validation meant more to me than any media coverage or social recognition. This was measurable impact on the communities I'd committed my life to serving. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "The Department of Education wants to pilot your comprehensive support model in 50 districts nationwide. They're asking if you'd consider a federal appointment to oversee the implementation." The offer was both thrilling and daunting. A federal position would mean national influence, resources to scale our successful programs, and the opportunity to shape policy at the highest levels. It would also mean leaving my classroom, at least temporarily. "I'll need to think about it," I said, "and discuss it with Alexander and the foundation boards." "Of course. But Natasha, this is the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a generation. Your work here has proven that someone with classroom experience can design and implement policy that actually works. The education community needs your voice at the national level." As she left, I sat alone in my classroom, surrounded by the student artwork and learning materials that had been constants throughout my transformation. The federal appointment would represent the ultimate validation of my journey from hidden teacher to public advocate, but it would also require sacrificing the daily classroom experiences that grounded all my other work. My phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Lunch at home? Have news about the European expansion you'll want to hear." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in our conservatory, sharing salad and updates about our respective morning achievements. Alexander's company was launching educational technology initiatives in 6 European countries, partnerships that had grown directly out of our foundation's pilot programs. "The interesting part," he said, cutting into his sandwich, "is that they specifically want an educator on the implementation team, someone with classroom experience who understands how technology actually functions in real teaching environments." I looked at him suspiciously. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an option. Federal appointment, international consulting, or continued focus on regional foundation work. You have choices that didn't exist a year ago." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who entered with the afternoon mail and a slightly bemused expression. "Mrs. Ashworth, you've received another invitation that I think you'll find interesting." He handed me an elegant envelope with familiar letterhead. "The White House?" I read aloud. "State dinner honoring education innovators from around the world," Thomas explained. "You're listed as a keynote speaker." Alexander grinned. "I think we can safely say your sister no longer needs to worry about you fitting in at social events." The mention of Delilah reminded me of the lunch meeting we'd scheduled for later in the week. Over the past year, our relationship had slowly rebuilt itself on entirely new foundations. Her real estate expertise had proven invaluable for the foundation's facility improvement projects, and she'd discovered genuine satisfaction in using her business skills for educational advancement rather than personal enrichment. More importantly, she'd learned to celebrate my achievements without feeling diminished by them. Last month, she'd hosted a fundraising event at her agency that raised $200,000 for the Teacher Support Initiative, the first time she'd ever publicly used our family connection for something other than her own advancement. "Speaking of family," I said, pulling out my own phone, "I should call Mom and Dad about the White House invitation. They're still adjusting to having a daughter who gets invited to state dinners." The previous month, when I'd been featured on the cover of Education Today magazine, Dad had bought 15 copies and distributed them to everyone at his retirement community. Mom had started a scrapbook documenting my transformation that she showed to anyone willing to look. As I prepared to return to school for the afternoon session, Alexander caught my hand. "Have I mentioned lately how proud I am of what you've built?" he said. "What we've built," I corrected. "None of this would have been possible without your support and resources." "The resources were always there," he replied. "But the vision, the expertise, the authentic commitment to making a difference, that's all you." Walking back across the estate grounds toward the car that would take me to my afternoon classes, I reflected on how completely my understanding of success had been transformed. A year ago, I'd measured my life by what I could hide and avoid. Now I measured it by what I could accomplish and contribute. The shy teacher who had been afraid of social attention had become someone who used public platforms to advocate for systemic change. The woman who had accepted her sister's diminishment had become someone who set her own standards for what was possible. The wife who had hidden her marriage had become someone who modeled how privilege could be used responsibly for public good. Tonight's 60 Minutes interview would be watched by millions of people, many of whom would see me as proof that educators could be effective leaders, that wealth could be deployed for genuine social benefit, that authenticity and ambition weren't mutually exclusive. But tomorrow morning, I would be back in room 127, teaching percentages to third graders who saw me first as their teacher, the role that had started this entire transformation and remained the source of everything meaningful I'd accomplished since. The future stretched ahead with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine: federal appointments, international partnerships, policy innovations that could reshape how societies support education. but all of it would be grounded in the simple truth I'd learned in this extraordinary year. The most powerful transformation isn't becoming someone different. It's becoming fully, authentically, unapologetically yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.